It started with an urgent news flash on screens across the world. China announces export controls targeting Japanese firms. Reporters scrambled for details as global markets reacted in real time. Trading floors in Tokyo and Shanghai were suddenly abuzz with confusion and concern. The export crackdown marked the sharpest escalation in trade tensions between Asia's two largest economies in over a decade. Within hours, Japanese tech stocks plunged. Media outlets aired footage of worried executives outside their headquarters, fielding questions from anxious investors and employees. On social media, hashtags trended as citizens in both countries expressed shock and frustration. Overnight, what had been simmering trade friction boiled over into a full-blown crisis. The world watched as Beijing's official statement cited new national security priorities, listing sensitive materials and technologies subject to immediate restrictions. For Japan, a key supplier of advanced semiconductors and specialty chemicals, the news hit hard. The ban's scope and suddenness left analysts and officials scrambling for answers, with industry leaders warning of ripple effects across the global supply chain. The new export controls were outlined in a sweeping order from China's Ministry of Commerce. The legal basis came from an updated export control law, expanded to cover not just military items, but also dual-use technologies. These include goods with both civilian and military applications. Think advanced microchips, precision machinery, and rare earth metals. China's revised rules require exporters to obtain licenses for any item on the new control list. The government cited risks to national security and public interest as justification. Companies found violating the regulations could face heavy fines or even criminal charges. The law also empowers officials to deny exports to entities or countries deemed a threat to China's interests. This is not the first time China has tightened export controls, but the focus on Japan is unprecedented. The measures apply not only to Chinese firms, but also to foreign invested companies operating on Chinese soil. In effect, the new regime gives Beijing significant leverage over global supply chains that rely on Chinese-made components and materials. Japanese companies with deep links to China felt the impact first. The new rules target sectors where Japan has global leadership: semiconductors, electronic components, batteries, and high-grade specialty chemicals. Industry insiders say firms like Sony, Toyota, Panasonic, and Renesas Electronics are especially vulnerable. Raw materials such as rare earths and critical minerals, essential for Japanese manufacturing, are now subject to licensing. This disrupts supply lines for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. The chemical sector, led by names like Sumitomo Chemical and Shin-Etsu, faces delays as they scramble to adjust procurement strategies. Japan's automakers, already battered by chip shortages, now face further uncertainty. Industry associations have warned of a cascade effect, with smaller suppliers hit hardest. The new export regime means Japanese firms must navigate a maze of paperwork, regulatory hurdles, and unexpected costs to keep their factories running. From Beijing's perspective, the export crackdown is about more than trade. Officials argue that tighter controls are necessary to safeguard national security and prevent proliferation of sensitive technologies. Citing rising geopolitical tensions, Beijing claims the move is a response to similar restrictions imposed by other countries, including Japan. The Chinese government has long warned about the risks of advanced technologies being used for military purposes. The new export law, they say, brings China's policies in line with international norms on non-proliferation. Chinese state media point to recent export bans by Washington and Tokyo targeting Chinese firms, framing Beijing's latest action as defensive and justified. Still, critics argue that national security claims are sometimes used to mask economic or political motives. For Beijing, the new controls send a clear message. China will protect its interests and is prepared to use trade policy as a tool in broader strategic competition. Tokyo's response was swift and firm. The Japanese government summoned China's ambassador to lodge a formal protest, calling the measures, quote, unacceptable and harmful to the rules-based order. Japanese officials demanded clarification and urged Beijing to reconsider. Trade Minister Hiroshi Moriyama called for urgent consultations through diplomatic channels. Industry groups echoed government concerns. The Japan Business Federation, or Keidan-Ren, warned that the export crackdown could destabilize global supply chains and hurt both economies. Stock markets reflected the anxiety. with the Nikkei index falling sharply in early trading. Investors dumped shares of exposed companies, driving down valuations across the tech sector. Market analysts noted that uncertainty alone was enough to rattle confidence. Some Japanese firms announced contingency plans, including alternative sourcing and temporary production halts. The sense of urgency was palpable as both government and industry braced for further escalations. Trade between China and Japan is massive, over $350 billion annually. Each country is a crucial supplier and customer for the other. Japanese companies source raw materials and components from China, while Chinese manufacturers depend on Japanese machinery and technology. These ties underpin much of Asia's economic growth. The export crackdown highlights the fragility of these connections. Disruptions in one country quickly ripple across the region and the globe. For example, Japan's role in the semiconductor supply chain means that delays in Japanese factories can affect tech industries worldwide, from Silicon Valley to Seoul. Analysts say the stakes go beyond economics. Stability in China-Japan trade is seen as a pillar of the global trading system. Prolonged tensions could force a realignment of supply chains, with long-term consequences for competitiveness and innovation in both countries. Experts warn that the export crackdown signals a broader trend, the weaponization of trade policy. As countries compete for technological advantage, export controls are, increasingly used as strategic tools. This introduces new risks for companies and investors, who must now monitor not just market trends, but also geopolitical flashpoints. Supply chain specialists say Japan's vulnerability lies in its reliance on Chinese materials. Diversifying suppliers is costly and time-consuming, especially for high-tech industries with strict quality requirements. At the same time, Chinese firms also risk losing access to Japanese know-how and equipment, which could slow their own technological progress. Some experts predict more frequent trade disputes as economic security trumps free trade. They warn that companies must build geopolitical resilience, planning for sudden shocks, building buffer inventories, and hedging against political risk. The days of stable, predictable trade may be over. The international response was swift. The European Union, United States, and South Korea expressed concern about the escalating dispute. Calls for restraint echoed at the United Nations and World Trade Organization. All sides must avoid further escalation, said a spokesperson for the WTO, urging dialogue and respect for multilateral trade rules. Business groups in the US and Europe warned that the China-Japan standoff could disrupt global supply chains and set a dangerous precedent. The American Chamber of Commerce in Japan issued a statement calling for transparent and fair export controls that do not target specific countries. Diplomatic efforts are underway to mediate the dispute. Regional forums like ASEAN and the G20 have offered to facilitate talks. While no breakthrough has been reached yet, there is broad consensus that continued confrontation would damage the global economy. Inside boardrooms across Japan and beyond, executives are rethinking their supply chain strategies. Many are accelerating efforts to diversify suppliers, seeking alternatives in Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America. Some are exploring reshoring critical production back to Japan to reduce vulnerability. Risk management has become a top priority. Companies are investing in real-time supply chain monitoring and scenario planning. This includes building closer relationships with backup suppliers and increasing buffer inventories of key materials. For some, the costs are high, but seen as necessary insurance in an era of rising geopolitical risk. Consulting firms say demand for geopolitical risk audits has surged since the crackdown. The overall message is clear. The old model of globalized, just-in-time production is being re-examined. Flexibility and resilience are now as important as efficiency. Both the Chinese and Japanese governments have issued public statements emphasizing the need for dialogue. Beijing says it remains open to talks but insists that export controls are a matter of national sovereignty. Tokyo, for its part, is pushing for negotiations and international mediation to ease tensions. Diplomatic channels remain active, with regular contact at ministerial and working levels. Industry groups on both sides are urging compromise, warning of long-term damage if the standoff continues. Meanwhile, the world's eyes are fixed on Asia, watching to see whether diplomacy can prevail. For now, uncertainty dominates. Companies, investors, and workers in both countries are adjusting to a new normal. The export crackdown may mark a turning point, not just in China-Japan relations, but in the way the world manages trade, technology, and security in the 21st century.